Our speaker this evening is well known to most of you, but perhaps less known to some of you, especially those who may be attending Constitution Day for the first time. Dr. Paul de Alvarez came to the University of Dallas in the fall of 1964 and regularly served as chairman of the department and director of our graduate program for over that whole 50-year period of time. Professor de Alvarez has published a translation of Machiavelli's Prince and a full-length commentary on that work titled The Machiavellian Enterprise. He has also published numerous articles on Shakespeare and other topics, but those of you who have had the pleasure of attending his classes know that he is also an authority on Plutarch, Xenophon, Plato, Aristotle, the Federalist, Tocqueville, and a host of other writers. As an example of the range of his expertise, I recall a graduate student one time commenting, "I give up. He even knows more about the Cowboys' interior line play than I do," which apparently wasn't very good today. Permit me to add a brief personal note. In my years as a student and instructor here at the University of Dallas, I sat in on about 24 classes taught by Dr. de Alvarez. He was also the first reader on my dissertation. And so without doing an injustice to my other professors, some of whom are now colleagues, still colleagues, I could say that my education was formed largely by his teaching. That does not mean that he is to blame for whatever shortcomings I may have. Those are entirely my own doing. In my first, a brief story about it. In my first semester of coursework in graduate school, I remember as if it were yesterday, though it now is 30 years ago, being assigned to read Cicero's De Republica, and then attending class on the material, where it occurred to me that I must have read the wrong assignment. For what the professor had to say had seemingly little correspondence with what I had read, or so I thought. It turns out, of course, that it had little to do with what I thought I had read, or what I had read was not the text that was assigned, but what I wanted to read or discover in the text. Learning to read a text, or truly reading a text, takes a generous amount of time and effort, but is immensely liberating, as I discovered in those classes. Considering the noble efforts he has undertaken over the decades here at UD, especially in safeguarding the extraordinary focus on the liberal arts curriculum, which we like to claim is the special mark of the university, Dr. de Alvarez, I will suggest to you, is first and foremost a teacher. One cannot be in his classroom, paying attention, for too long before realizing that we are blessed with having someone who is most profoundly concerned with understanding the greatest thinkers, with mining their texts for the deepest of truths, and with conveying that education to those who really are not quite prepared to receive it. If a liberal arts education, the kind of education we seek to promote here at the university, if by that education we commit ourselves to a serious investigation of the unadulterated truth, as pleasing or as discomforting as it might be, in Dr. de Alvarez we have the surest of guides. We are thankful for that great gift he has bestowed upon us and hope for many more years of his presence. Tonight, please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul de Alvarez, who will speak on the topic, What Constitution Have We?
Thank you, Rich. Professor Paul, Cowboys of old, the Landry Cowboys. I gave up on the next coming of the Cowboys. Sorry about that. And you also make me feel very old. 50 years. Good heavens. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to be teaching here, and a pleasure to have such students as Dr. Dougherty. Anyway, to Constitution Day. The reason to celebrate Constitution Day, of course, is that the United States is the first and most successful example of a political order based on a written constitution. Today, as you know, it is and I hope you understand how wonderful that is, it is the oldest polity in existence, having preserved essentially the same political institutions since the time of George III of England, Louis XVI of France, and Catherine the Great of Russia. It's remarkable how things have changed in the world and how, in a fundamental sense, how unchanged the United States has been. I decided on the title, What Constitution Have We? After I heard it repeatedly said that we should read the Constitution for ourselves and heard of offers made to send to those who ask this little booklet copies of the Declaration and Constitution. I didn't like the image in a way of people, maybe I should, holding up the Constitution and shouting in the White House and Congress. Maybe we should do that, got to think of it. Obviously, however, it was thought necessary to call upon people to read the Constitution again, because it became especially evident in the past few years that even our public officials seem to be ignorant of the Constitution, indeed abysmally ignorant, or perhaps better, contemptuous of it. The difficulty, however, is that our Constitution cannot simply be the one written in 1787, not even the one that we now have with all the amendments. And the amendments, by the way, add a different story to it. That's another very long story that we can't get into here. And I would suggest that we should distinguish it from the Constitution that supposedly lies behind the mass of constitutional cases decided by the courts. Or as Professor Lynn Aurelius of UT Austin Law School said, constitutional law has nothing to do with the Constitution. And I think he's right. As was even more recently proven, it seems to me. So, what is a Constitution? The Constitution is what we hold to be authoritative. It is finally the order that we have in our souls. That does not mean, of course, that we ought not know the written text as it emerged from the Philadelphia Convention. We must, of course, begin with it and attempt to understand it with the greatest seriousness. The difficulty is that we cannot understand it if we are no longer formed by what we might call the unwritten Constitution on which that written Constitution is based. A Constitution, as Aristotle tells us, is what a people understand to be its way on deliberating on what they as a people are to do about the issues that confront them. War and peace, foreign policy, law, judicial cases, the auditing of officials. Wilbur Kendall was the founder of the Politics and Economics Department here at UD. I'll mention in passing the youngest ever admitted to Northwestern University, and a Rhodes Scholar, and one who should have risen in the academy and in the intellectual world, but always got into difficulties because of his heterodox opinions, as well as his tendency to get into one scrape or the other. But anyway, he spoke of Americans as having their Constitution in their hips, not in their minds, not in their reason, but in their hips. Consider then what constitutions the 1787 Constitution presupposes. I will set aside the amendments, as I said, because they complicate matters considerably. First of all, its language is English. Was not this language decisively shaped by Shakespeare and the Bible? Are not our political and moral sensibilities shaped by that language? Tocqueville reports, for example, that in his travels to the remotest corners of America in 1828, he found them reading Shakespeare. Henry V, I think, he mentions particularly. Another constitution shared with the English-speaking peoples is, of course, the British Constitution. One thinks, after all, of Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. And what also especially connects the U.S. Constitution to that of the British and to the whole tradition of Anglo-Saxon law is the common law. Something that we have forgotten, I think, since an infamous case of Erie Canal. But the common law presupposes that there is always a law, even if it has not been legislated or established by some authority. It is the law that has been followed, it says, from Blackstone, the memory of man running not to the contrary. The common law may perhaps be best seen, it seems to me, in the way we expect public bodies to conduct themselves. We see it, for example, in the way Robert's Rules of Order is followed in meetings of all kinds. Almost, you can spontaneously, that happens. That is the common law that we simply assume, that there is to be an order in public bodies that is to be followed. The common law is the application of reason from accepted standards of justice to particular circumstances. It is especially concerned with due process, questions of due process, property, and generally the rights listed in the first 10 amendments. And then one must think of the Declaration of Independence as a constitution, which states the standards and principles by which the Constitution is guided. The Declaration and the Constitution are, it seems to me, inseparable. For the latter, it establishes an actual political order that embodies the principles of the Declaration, which one can see simply from reading the preamble to the Constitution. Then there are the state constitutions, another aspect of what I call the Constitution in our soul. The states, after all, were more important to the American people until well into the 19th century and the 20th. One thinks of Robert E. Lee, who chose Virginia over the Union. There in the state constitutions, one also finds the language and spirit of the common law and the natural right language of the Declaration. After all, Article 1 of the Texas Constitution is the Bill of Rights, and its preamble invokes Almighty God. Now, to say that there are a set of standards and guides by which the American people direct themselves in their deliberations is to say that there is an implicit understanding of what the best regime is. The best regime draws upon reason for its understanding of human nature and of political order. And, of course, we know of another best regime that has to do with the salvation of the soul. And we see both of these regimes implied in some state constitutions, particularly I would emphasize the early ones, in the Declaration of Independence, which, after all, refers to God in its three aspects as a Trinity, as Creator, Supreme Providence, and Judge. And one is reminded of the Constitution's exception of Sundays in the time given by the President to return a bill. It presupposes now that this is a people formed in that way, that Sundays are to be accepted. There is the reference in the Constitution to the year of our Lord. And there is, of course, the First Amendment's reference to free exercise of religion. I mentioned the First Amendment because there is now, if you have not noticed it, a concerted attack upon the liberties mentioned there: speech, religion, and assembly. Watch for that as in the coming days. So these are the constitutions that have established what is authoritative for us. In Aristotelian language, they have given us our understanding of the comprehensive human good. What happens, however, when there is a denial that there are eternal truths and eternal standards of justice? What happens when a challenge is made to the understanding implicit in the Constitution? What we face today is not so much a different interpretation of the Constitution, the usual kind of issues. Is it a legislative supremacy constitution? Are there no limits to the president's exercise of executive power? Are there limits to the legislature that need to be set by a kind of arbitration board of 9? Does the president have something like the federative power? Does the Supreme Court have the final say in the interpretation of the Constitution? These are the usual issues one thinks of in terms of the differing interpretations of the Constitution. Kendall used to have a lecture in which he spoke of 5 constitutions and how they grew. One constitution was the Philadelphia Legislative Supremacy Constitution. Another constitution was the Bill of Rights Constitution. Another constitution, because of course, in the end, with respect to the Philadelphia Constitution, a Bill of Rights was specifically turned down in the convention. The idea of listing rights seemed to them to be useless, if not dangerous, as perhaps it was turned out to be. Then there was the Supreme Court Constitution, which claims this through Marbury versus Madison, which claims to be the final interpreter of the Constitution. And then there is what he called the Walter Cronkite Constitution, which sought the promotion of what we would call, what in those days was called the liberal principles of equality. He used to shout at the end of Walter Cronkite's newscast. You would not know this perhaps, but Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man, it said, in broadcast television. And when Walter Cronkite said that we had lost in Vietnam, we had lost in Vietnam. It was that was the pronouncement, and President Johnson accepted it. But he used to shout at the end of the newscast, and that's not the way it is, Walter. So the principles of the Declaration today are abhorrent to the contemporary understanding. Indeed, to that which is dominant in our intellectual elites. That is, those in the educational institutions of the land and formed by those educational institutions. Unfortunately, from nursery to professional and graduate schools. An intellectual, as Alexander Kojev, an Hegelian, tells us, is one who does nothing, for he neither works nor fights. So by definition, that's the Hegelian definition. What he does is speak. He speaks about the rational world, the rational state promised by the movement of history. What he does, to sum it up, is popularize, bring to the people his idea of the state. And this is the task of all those who work in the realm of speech, the journalist, the novelist, the poet, everyone in the realm of communication and entertainment. The claim of the intellectual is that he has come to know history, and what must be set aside is any supposition that there is an unchanging human nature, that there are transcendent and eternal truths, and that there is an underlying intelligibility in things. We have certain values, quote unquote. Why we have certain values, quote unquote, is because we are formed by the stage of history in which we find ourselves. Thus, we are 21st century Americans, and we cannot be otherwise. Everything we think to be good is dependent on that fact. And if we try to transcend our time, to look back to the values of the past, say 1787, we end as reactionaries. We are not progressive. We are denying the development of mankind or of humankind, and in going back to what we suppose is simply true, we necessarily distort what we think is the truth, for we can only understand that in 21st century terms. We are thus doubly in error when we try to do so, try to go back and rescue the, quote, values of the past. We are doubly in error. We put forward a perverse understanding of the good, and we refuse to accept the progress history has made to an understanding of the human good. I found the clearest and most direct statement of this point in Richard Rorty's category, irony, and solidarity. He declares that we can keep the notion of morality just insofar we can cease to think of morality as the divine part of ourselves, and instead think of it as the voice of ourselves as members of a community, speakers of a common language, and I would add, at a certain stage in history. He comments, therefore, an immoral action is on this account the sort of thing which, if done at all, is done only by animals or by people of other families, tribes, cultures, or historical epochs. If done by one of us, or if done repeatedly by one of us, that person ceases to be one of us. She becomes an outcast, someone who doesn't speak our language, even though she may once has appeared to do so. That explains, it seems to me, the vilification, the use of obscene and brutal language, in condemning those who are who disagree with the progress in history. That is, only one kind of understanding is acceptable. The age of liberalism, you should understand, is over. The progressives are to see to it that the new order that history demands is to be implemented. We see it all around us, what we eat and drink, what we wear, how we use energy and water, how we regard sexual relations, how we raise our children, what we are going to be permitted to read and write, say, and hear, what we may or may not believe regarding the divine. Every detail will be controlled by what the new order regards as the good. The point to understand is that every activity that might lead people to doubt the soundness of such a society is to be suppressed. Rorty says this very clearly. He says, for example, it must forbid every teaching, every suggestion that there are politically relevant natural differences among men which cannot be established or neutralized by progressing scientific knowledge. So not merely to counter it with argument, but to suppress it. Now, that's the point. Now, forbid everything, every suggestion must be suppressed. What then, to conclude, is the constitution in our soul? As is often said these days, we have a choice between two radically different understandings, not merely of political order, but of all things. Wilmer Kendall succinctly stated the task the American people face in his essay on Richard Weaver. The people, he said, must develop historical memory, that is, knowledge of their own traditions, lest, in ignorance of them, they forget, like madmen, what and who they are.